Thank you for everyone for joining today's virtual conversation today for United Alliance, featuring Brad Fitch, President and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation, as well as Professor Doug Koopman of Calvin University, Professor of Political Science. And today's conversation is going to be on Congress, Showhorses versus Workhorses. So, but before beginning the conversation and introductions, I want to bring in Mark Middleton, the 2021 Realtor Political Action Committee Chair for the Pinellas Realtor Organization. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Travis. And I apologize that my camera is not working. It won't come on for some reason, but maybe we're better off not seeing my face anyway. So I just wanted to welcome the Lions members to the first virtual conversation, Congress, Workhorses versus Showhorses. The topic today is relevant not only because what we see in TV isn't entirely reflective of all of Congress, but also because of NAR's advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. We've been successful because of how realtors and NAR's staff impact federal policy by partnering with workhorses in Congress, regardless of their political affiliation. At the local level, PRO and CPRO's federal political coordinator has been successful working with our own workhorse representative, Charlie Crist, to make sure Congress continues to fund the National Flood Insurance Program while simultaneously working to reform the program so that it is sustainable, instead of seeking extension after extension. Without financial support of our major investors in the Realtors Political Action Committee, NAR wouldn't be able to support the House and Senate candidates that will work with realtors after being elected to their offices. I wanted to especially thank Brad Fitch, the president of Congressional Management Foundation in Washington, D.C., and Professor Doug Koopman, but it's spelled Koopman, of the Political Science Department at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I'm actually from Detroit, so hey. Very warm welcome. Thanks for having a conversation with us today. Our Political Communications and Advocacy Manager, Travis Norton, is going to take it from here, and you guys are in great hands. I can't wait to see the program.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. So today's, I've been looking forward to this conversation since I started these virtual conversations last year, and this is one that I've really wanted to make it timely. So this is actually once we Congress started to get into their new session and we started seeing what's been working through policy. I really wanted to make sure that our members sort of understood like what they see on TV isn't necessarily what goes on in Congress, 365 days a year. There's actually a lot of work that gets done. And I want to invite two individuals to have a conversation that really know about the insides and outs of Congress and how it operates. And so Brad and Professor Doug Koopman were the best, were my best panelists. And I'm glad that they were able to accept today's invite to join this conversation. And I know that our members will find a lot of value in this one. And so I'd like to introduce Professor Doug Koopman. He's a professor of political science at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, my hometown. And I also went to Calvin University, and that's how I know the professor there. And so, but after graduating from Hope College in 1979 with a degree in mathematics, Professor Koopman moved to Washington, D.C., where he earned a master's in theological studies at Wesley Theological Seminary in 1984. He then went on to study at the Catholic University of America, receiving a PhD in American government in 1992. Professor joined the Calvin faculty in 1995 after 15 years working in national politics. He has interrupted his academic work at times for assignments in politics, government, and higher education leadership, including last year during the pandemic at the Congressional Management Foundation, being a fellow there. The professor has co-authored 2 college texts, Understanding American Politics and Religion, and American Politics, Classic and Contemporary Perspectives. Professor Koopman speaks about his academic specialties and teaching interests to a range of audiences. He is a periodic source for Michigan and regional media, and has also been quoted in the Washington Post and the Chronicles of Higher Education. And now I'd like to introduce Brad Fitch, President and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation. Fitch started his communications career at the age of 16, working at his local AM radio station upstate New York, and a disc jockey and a reporter. After graduate school, he worked as a television reporter in Washington, moving on to Capitol Hill for 13 years as a press secretary, legislative director, and chief of staff. In 2001, he served as deputy director of CMF, a nonprofit dedicated to improving congressional operations and citizen engagement. He left CMF in 2006 to form a successful internet startup before returning to CMF in 2010. Fitch is frequently quoted in national media outlets on how Congress works. He is also the author of Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials and Media Relations, Handbook for Agencies, Associations, Nonprofits, and Congress. So the first topic I wanted to have a conversation on is basically what we had, the title of this. So this is Showhorses versus Workhorses in Congress. And Brad is probably one of the very few people in DC that if he was to go through the Rayburn cafeteria, he could probably identify the names and faces of every 535 member of US Congress there, and as well as their chiefs of staff. So that's very hard to do, considering I could probably identify 20 congressional members on the House side and maybe about 10 on the Senate side. So Brad's the perfect individual to start talking about the ins and outs and what he does already and what they do at Congressional Management Foundation as well. So Brad, if you'd like to talk about, first of all, what you do at Congressional Management Foundation and what Congressional CMF for short does, and then also talk about what you guys do with behind the scenes in Congress with the workhorses.
Well, thank you, Travis, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience. So the Congressional Management Foundation is a unique nonprofit that was formed 44 years ago by former members of Congress. And basically, we do two things. We work with the U.S. Congress as kind of like small business consultants, help them be more effective and build more trust between them and their constituents, everything from better websites to better communications with constituents to better operations overall. But we also work with citizen advocates. We're the leading trainer of citizen advocates in the U.S. More than 91,000 Americans have participated in one of our programs through associations and nonprofits. And that's been my long relationship with the National Association of Realtors and also many state realtor associations. We just did a great series with the Texas Realtors, helping you and your members be more effective. And we've worked with your FPCs, your federal political coordinators, every 2 years for the last 6 years, and have been really enjoying the opportunity. In fact, we're doing another program tomorrow. If you have an FPC that's participating on our training program tomorrow. So it's been a long-standing partnership between the Congressional Management Foundation and the National Association of Realtors. You kicked this off by talking about, the workhorses for the show horses, and I'm really glad because the show horses get all the attention, whether it's everyone from AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who may be a really good worker too, but she's obviously got a lot of profile, or Ted Cruz, who may be a really good worker, but obviously there's a lot of show there too. And we do a lot of work with the other percentage of members that are not on the Sunday morning talk shows. In fact, I'll give you just a data point. If you look at the Sunday morning talk shows on an annual basis, only 10% of members of Congress are on the Sunday morning talk shows. The other 90% are not. They may be seen by their local officials, but they're just not part of that broader group. And the other point that in looking at the workhorses, that where you get a distorted view of the United States Congress, is the media is covering hot button issues that the Congress is working on, and not all of the other issues they're working on. And primarily those issues are immigration, guns, abortion, and sometimes healthcare. And those are what dominate political campaigns. That's what dominates a lot of the conversation. We actually did an analysis in 2017 looking at the votes in the United States Senate. And the total number of votes in 17, and we included terrorism on that list as well, of those 5 votes: terrorism, healthcare, immigration, guns, and abortion. That represented 7% of the activity of the United States Senate. The other 93% is working on things like flood insurance, or whether or not horses should be transported on double-decker trucks, or whether or not ophthalmologists or optometrists should be able to perform procedures at VA hospitals. And these are just not what we call reputational or electoral issues, meaning their election's not going to win or lose based on their position on that, and their reputation isn't defined by the position that they take on flood insurance. I know many of you wish members of Congress won or lost their election based on their position on flood insurance, but it's just not the political reality. That that's just not something that's goes to the broader electorate. I think the other point that I would make before I turn it over to Doug and get his feedback and input on this question is, you cannot underestimate the amount of work that's going on right now and that has been going on in the last 20 to 30 days. This is the 6th president that I have watched be inaugurated and come in. The first one was, I worked during the end of the Reagan administration when I got my start on Capitol Hill and saw the inauguration of George H.W. Bush. A lot easier for a staffer to watch the inauguration in 1989, folks, than it was in 2021. I can tell you that. I literally walked across the street from my office building, walked through a gate, watched him raise his arm, walk back, and got back to work. I mean, that was a lot different than it is today, I can assure you. And I can tell you these new administrations, especially this one, are incredibly active. And of course, dealing with the pandemic and the economic implications of that, the Biden administration has been just a whirlwind of activities. And whether you're talking about 2009, when Obama was inaugurated, or 2001 when George W. Bush was inaugurated, or 1993, there's just incredible activities. Now, what that means for you as a citizen advocate on some levels means the competition's a little tougher. That trying to get their attention is going to take a little extra effort, a little more sophisticated effort. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the broadcast, but generally expect that this administration and this Congress is going to be incredibly busy. I mean, I was looking at the schedule just today of what's going on, and the Senate's got nomination after nomination. They're considering a vote on whether to raise the minimum wage. They're looking at a COVID relief package that's totaling $1.9 trillion. I mean, the House is just as busy. So this is a very, very active time, especially compared to, 2020, where, basically things start to shut down very early. So that would be the last point before I turn it over to Doug to talk a little bit about his perspective on workhorses and show horses. Doug?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks. Yeah, I'm talking a little bit from my experience on Capitol Hill from 1980 to 1995, and then periodically coming back both to work in House and Senate offices, but also to do advocacy for private colleges for a while. And I like the show horse versus workhorse comparison. On the other hand, there are some issues that being a show horse helps one's work product. One is able to do more work because one is well known in the national constituency. But I first want to underline the truth of what Brad said about how much work actually goes on day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year to manage the annual reauthorizations or the triennial reauthorizations of big pieces of the federal government and the annual appropriations that have to go through the appropriation subcommittees in the House and the Senate, and how 85% of the members of the House and Senate are doing that quiet work behind the scenes, or certainly dedicating their staffs, a good share of their staffs, to do that and to do that well. That is the real work, the annual work and the regular work of the House and the Senate, to pass laws that keep government programs going, to oversee where it's not working and to readjust them, such as in flood insurance, to Medicare, to anything else, to have oversight about how these things are working. And so there is a quiet set of workhorses. And if you're a member of Congress, if your local representative or someone near you is one of those people, those are the people to become very familiar with and work with and latch on to and know a lot about and to support in the ways they want to be supported. The show horses, I think what I see more members of Congress who are show horses, mostly for show. Political science thinks there's three ways to be influential internally in the House and the Senate. It's knowing policy, very, very good. Knowing a piece of policy like higher education, and other members will go to that person to know about colleges and universities, or to know about free trade, or to know about economic development, or the building trades, for example. So policy expertise, and those typically resides in committees and committee staffs, the normal committees and committee staffs in the House and Senate. Another expertise is the procedure. You know, you can have a great idea, but if you don't know how to get it through the subcommittee and the committee and the House floor and through the Rules Committee, and to avoid challenging amendments, and to get it to the other chamber, and to get it through that chamber, and to get it to a conference and get it signed and over to the president. If you don't know that procedure, and there are members of Congress who specialize in that procedure, both the knowledge and how to use it to policy ends. And then there is the partisan fundraising, advocating for the party, advocating for the headline ideas about the political party. Those are three, 100-year to 200-year tracks of influence within the chambers of the House and the Senate. And I do think in the last 30 years, the committee path has become smaller, and the committee path has become somewhat secondary to both the procedure, which gets centralized in party leadership, and to some extent to the publicity and the partisanship. And so the three lines and trains still run: policy expertise, mostly through committees; procedural expertise, really with leadership and a few committees; and then partisanship and fundraising and defending the values and the views of a political party. They've always been in existence. I do think there is more power with the partisan presentation now than there has been in the past. And so workhorses need to be friendly to and familiar with the show horses to some extent, to the partisans and to the procedural people, to accomplish their goals. And so the interaction between the two is a little bit different, but you still have members of Congress who, for their gifts and their abilities and their interests and their short-term goals and their long-term goals, they really do pick one of those three to specialize in. And there's still the vast majority, I think, are really good workhorses, just trying to do well by their constituencies and work for their district. But the equation between the three is a little bit different, I think, in the modern era with social media and with a negative partisanship in politics generally than it was in the past. But there's still lots of workhorses are doing the annual work of the House and the Senate and of the federal government's legislative branch.
And before we go on, Travis, I do want to build on Doug's point, because I want to add a little bit of my perspective on the why the committee role has been diminished in certainly the 3 decades I've been working with the Congress. And I'm going to offer at this point a disclaimer. This is my personal opinion, not speaking for CMF, because I'm not supposed to say stuff like this. But I would say there's 2 main factors that have been at work here. And this has been documented by the political science community, including a current member of Congress, Congressman Price of North Carolina, who's a political scientist from North Carolina. And one is the leadership, and specifically the Speaker's office, began consolidating more and more power starting in 1995. But this was not just a partisan thing with Newt Gingrich. This also went on with Nancy Pelosi has done it, and Ryan did it, Hastert did it. It's just been a growing dissipation of power at the committee level. And what that means is the committee members don't have any power. And the loss of earmarks or congressionally directed spending in 2011 wasn't the beginning of the loss of power. It was the bookend to the end of it. It had been going on since 1994 in both parties. And that's one factor. Another factor that has reduced the role of committee chairman, especially during Republican control, is term limits for committee chairmen. And the reason for that was because some people felt the committee chairman got too powerful, and maybe they did. The pendulum swung too far. While we're talking about Michigan, we had a great Congressman, John Dingell, wonderful chairman from Michigan, but was rather all powerful as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Now the pendulum has swung much more away from the committee chairman. And if you've got a 6-year term as a committee chairman, you're pretty much looking for a job in your 2nd year, and you got to look to leadership for that job. So you're not seeing a lot of work being done at the committee level. And that's where usually that was where most of the work is done. Now, right now, there are a number of proposals that are floating around in the House of Representatives we're not using the E word or earmark word because it's such a dirty word in Congress, which it really wasn't, but that's another story and another 45-minute lecture. But we're talking about congressionally directed spending that would be very limited, extremely limited, small amounts of money, fewer earmarks, for-profit companies not being considered, only nonprofits and governmental entities. And generally, Congressional Management Foundation favors that because the Congress was given the power of the purse by our founding fathers, and they keep giving away that power to the executive branch. And, you know, it's going to be better for members of Congress to have some say in how money is directed locally. So, but that was, I want to just add to one of the factors that I've observed as going on. And I think that we're seeing some things, and I know we'll be talking later about the modernization of Congress. We're definitely seeing some positive things on the horizon, that Congress is starting to what's called restoring their Article 1 powers, which Article 1 out of the Constitution created the United States Congress. I like to say the executive branch and the presidency was an afterthought. It wasn't certainly the first priority of the founding fathers. The Congress was, and they're starting to reassert it in really constructive ways. And so we can talk more about that later in the program when we talk more about the modernization of Congress.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate that the conversation on the committees, because that actually brings us to the second topic, and one that the professor and I have talked about in private conversations about, especially his experience and with the Contract of America, working with Senator Dick Armey, as well as Congressman P. Hoekstra. And so I want to give him some time to talk about the pros and cons of what in the 1995 reforms of Contract with America, specifically also talking about the Office of Technology Assessment. That was an office of the United States Congress from 72 to 95, which provided members and committees, like as Brad had talked about, with analysis of complex scientific and technical issues. And it was, and Brad, and once again, I'll allow the professor to go into why that was dissolved. But Professor, if you could talk about your experience in the 90s with Contract with America and the reforms that were made and the pros and cons of that we're seeing today that Brad had mentioned, I'd be appreciated to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I'm going to start a little bit talking to some extent about political philosophy and theory. Political science as a discipline sort of grew in the 1950s and the 1960s. And we had in Washington sort of a pragmatism, I would argue, not really first principles, not really thinking about federalism and separation of powers, but really an incrementalism, that you would pass laws about the environment and Congress would sort of incrementally tinker with those every year or every 2 or 3 years when the reauthorization was up. And it appeared to be non-ideological, and Republicans appeared to, there were plenty of moderate to middle of the road Republicans that crossed ideologically with conservative Democrats. And so there was a sort of non-ideological pragmatism about which resulted in kind of incremental growth of federal programs and federal agencies, et cetera. And it seemed non-ideological, but, Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey and other people in the House said, no, that's an ideology itself. The ideology that we want to counter that is back to localism, back to privatization, back to a smaller role for the federal government. And to some extent, the Contract with America era, which I was on the Hill during that period of time and participated, was this notion about the need to pull back what the federal government did in all areas and in every areas, and really to think about first principles beyond just sort of pragmatism about fixing problems and slowly expanding the footprint of Washington within society, within activities across the nation. So honestly, it's a good argument to have. Is the federal government too big? Does it defer not enough to local governments, to the private sector, to individuals, to states? And so it's really an argument of federalism and privatization and voluntary associations, which to me is an interesting sort of political theory argument, but it has practical implications. The way the Contract with America envisioned that was to cut committee staff by a third, to cut some of the scientific technical support agencies like the Office of Technology Assessment, to cut the Congressional Research Service and the Library of Congress, to reduce the power of the CPRO, hoping that to cut the staff and to strangle the staff a little bit, you would have less activity at the federal government. It really did not turn out to be that way. And I think to some extent there were good intentions to that, to try to have the national government do fewer things and to do those few things better, but also to assert, that as what the Republican Party was about. It was for localism and devolution and privatization and holding up voluntary associations and those kinds of things, as opposed to centralization of Washington and centralization of Washington in the House. Well, you know, a little bit of a good thing is a good thing. Too much of a good thing is a very bad thing. And in that process, really what Congress has done, it's really lost its ability and interest even in overseeing, I think, the executive branch and its ability to function as a good legislature, to understand what's going on, to revise laws in a timely way, and to have the information available to make good decisions. So, as Brad talked about, one pendulum swinging one way or the other, you know, into the leadership versus committee. I do think this pendulum has swung a little bit too far too. To have really, we're in a period of, I think, congressional decline, both in knowledge and capacity, and in interest to really be a full partner in Washington. And to some extent, the contract with America helped that go because it presented a sort of a philosophical argument for reducing the size of Congress without really understanding the limits to that argument.
Well, and I would just add to Doug, I thank you for the insight early, even though I was on the Hill, I wasn't that connected to, I've kind of played junior varsity my first couple of years on Capitol Hill. But the point I would add to it is he talked about the dissipation of power, and we're going to go into the next section talking about there is definitely an interest in the Congress for a rebirth and for an increased amount of power, and you're seeing it in a bipartisan way. And this, you know, this isn't about Democrats and Republicans on some levels. You know, this is about the legislative branch versus the executive branch. Yeah, I did an analysis just for fun a couple of years ago. What I called it was Moneyball for Congress. So you guys remember the famous book and movie Moneyball, where, you know, Brad Pitt, who played the real guy who did the actual analysis of the Oakland A's and looked at the characteristics of the players. Well, I looked at the characteristics of the players, except on the public policy playing field. And in my analysis, I looked at the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, because that's the one bill that gets passed every year and you've got to actually have a hearing on it. And I looked at three characters. I looked at the committee staffer who was staffing a sophomore member. I was looking at the Department of Defense official who was testifying on a particular provision, and I was looking at the lobbyist who was lobbying on that particular provision. Guess who had the most experience? It was the lobbyist who had worked in the White House, worked on Capitol Hill, was paid 6 or 7 times what his counterparts were. The DoD official had a lot of overall experience in the military, but it's a common practice in the military to rotate people in and out. So I only had 4 years experience working on the bill. The staffer had a master's degree in military affairs from a major university, but still only been working for 4 years and was making $70,000 a year, which was 1/10 of what the lobbyist was making. And so what, you know, to amplify the point, what Congress is now looking at is how can it improve? And it is starting to recognize that as we keep saying, the pendulum's gone too far away from the legislative branch having the authority and ability to do its job. The Congressional Management Foundation in 2017 did a novel survey of senior congressional staff. And we basically took a series of criteria that is normally used to measure emerging democracies and apply it to the United States Congress. No one had done that before. So we're saying, okay, this is how Venezuela is doing. Well, let's take the same criteria and see how the Congress is doing. And our findings were interesting but depressing. So one of the questions we asked was, how important is this aspect to a functioning legislative chamber versus how satisfied are you with that aspect? And one of the questions is that Congress needs to improve its staff, knowledge, skills, and abilities. 83% of senior staff said that was important or very important. Only 15% said they were very satisfied. It was one of our biggest gap. So that speaks to a little bit of what Doug was referencing, is the what's called the great brain drain, or Congress giving itself the lobotomy, which has occurred in the last 30 to 40 years. And I would argue, it unfortunately has been bipartisan. There's been no real effort until 2 years ago, when the House of Representatives created a new committee to look at the organization of the Congress, the operations of the institution, with an eye towards improving it. And that was a good tee up, because I know that's what Travis wanted to talk about next.
Yeah, and before moving on to that one, it is a great tee up in conversation. It is one of those things, if you're a bystander and you do watch TV and you're watching the committees and you hear people bickering with the person being interviewed. And then if you really go into it and you look up the congressional member and you look at how many bills they sponsored and passed that are on those committees, you would think based on what you see on there, wow, they're active, they're getting bills. But most of all of them have never passed a bill that they're the key sponsored by. And it is really interesting to follow that, and it shows just right there the impact also too, when people hear, when they see, they're interviewing, they have people for Google, CEO of Google, or Mark Zuckerberg, and they're asking them questions that typically like you would have gone through OTA and they would have had a resource for them, rather than they're treating them like trying to find answers right there in the committee hearings. So I appreciate you guys going over that. That is something that I'm glad that you guys went into detail on. So yeah, I want to go into the modernization of Congress here. And I know CMS has been at the forefront of that and making sure and collaborating and taking that information. And basically I want Brad, if you could talk about what goes into the modernization of Congress, what the needs are right now, and what the possible solutions are for it. It'd be appreciated if you could.
So I'm going to be willing to bet that the Miami Herald or the local papers in Florida didn't cover the fact that during the last 2 years, there have been a group of lawmakers working in the United States House of Representatives in a bipartisan way on a committee with equal representation that has come up with solutions to improve the United States Congress, with every solution passed in a unanimous fashion. And that is just like a magic trick. And that probably didn't get local coverage because, again, the media tendency is to cover all heat and no light. Congress actually working isn't going to win anybody a Pulitzer Prize. But that's what happened in the last 2 years. We had a committee that was chaired by a congressman from Washington State, Derek Kilmer, and the vice chair was a Republican, Tom Graves of Georgia. And they had a smattering of other committee members. The Congressional Management Foundation was honored to work with the committee. I was actually one of the few members who got to spend 6 hours with them during their first bipartisan private retreat in March of 2019 in a private room in the Library of Congress across the street from the Capitol building. And folks, if you could have been in that room for 6 hours like I was, you would have a completely different view of the United States Congress, because we saw dedicated public servants talking about why they got involved in public service. You had a farmer who was upset that regulations were too difficult in making a profit on his farm. You had a school teacher who just wanted to help kids. You had a prosecutor, a defense attorney, who got asked by the local mayor to look at the murder rate, and that just led to a seat in Congress. You had these people dedicated, and it helped. I will tell you that Derek Kilmer came from the business community as the chairman, and I've seen this happen in working with members of Congress. Many people who come from your sector of the economy make really terrific members of Congress, and they're great at customer service. I'll just give you an example. One of the the finalists for our Democracy Awards, that kind of like the Oscars for Congress in the constituent service category, is a businessman from Erie, Pennsylvania, Mike Kelly. He runs car dealerships, 3-time finalist for Democracy Awards because he's focused on customer service. So we see this in the Congress, that the business people often, not always, but often bring a very practical perspective to getting stuff done. My boss for 5 years in the United States Senate ran grocery stores, and oh my gosh, he was just totally fixated on getting stuff done right away. He couldn't stand the idea he had to wait a month to get a bill passed. And again, it was his business background of seeing a problem and fixing it. And I think that's very healthy, frankly, perspective in the United States Congress, especially compared to people who start off in public service, who sometimes get a little detached from reality if they've been, frankly, an elected official since they were 23 years old. So what the Modernization Committee did is it had a bunch of hearings in a bipartisan way. CMF was honored to testify. I testified in the summer of 2019 on a variety of issues, of everything from constituent engagement and how they can do a better job of interacting with citizens, to their scheduling operation, which was just, I can't use the words that I want to use describing what congressional scheduling is like. They also looked at a variety of other bigger picture issues vis-a-vis their role with the executive branch and their power. And they had some really good political scientists talk on that. And they passed 97 recommendations on a bipartisan basis by the end of the 116th Congress in 2019. Half of those were adopted by the House of Representatives in a resolution that was passed earlier in the year and are starting to be implemented. And one of them speaks directly to the question that Doug and Travis were talking about on something that used to be called the Office of Technology Assessment. Now, unfortunately, that brand got tarnished, good or bad. I'm not going to comment, but as a professional communicator, I was constantly urging them, don't use that term, because for a lot of Republicans, it's taboo. And said, don't say bring back the OTA, because a lot of Republicans said, well, that was partisan, it didn't do a good job, all these reasons. Our argument was, do you need greater technical assistance to understanding the complexities of issues such as cybersecurity and the internet and the proliferation of nuclear weapons? Would you like some more help understanding those issues? And of course, the answer was yes. Good, let's go find some people that will help you do that. And that's what they're doing, is they're trying to bring greater expertise into the United States Congress. They're also looking at staff retention. You know, the average tenure for a member in a House staff of a legislative assistant is 4.7 years. Well, any industry that's seeing that kind of turnover is really going to have some problems if you only get to see people for a few years. So we're looking at staff retention issues. Pay issues was another issue. We hope the United States Congress, and I know this is going to get some people probably steam coming out of their ears, but we hope they'll try to look at the concept of member pay in a nonpartisan way. Congress hasn't changed its pay for over 11 years, and their actual buying power has dropped 20%. And it's starting to have an impact on, frankly, recruiting candidates on both the Democratic and Republican side. Now, most Americans make about $50,000, $60,000 a year in their household, and $173,000 for a member sounds like a lot of money until you realize they have to maintain two households. They're professionals, and they could probably make a lot more money doing something else. And so we're losing some good members as well, because they're being drawn away to the private sector or as lobbyists, or some of them are going into think tanks, and they're just getting more money. So these are some of the thorny issues the Modernization Committee is trying to tackle. And I've just been really honored. I can tell you, in my 30 years of working with the Congress and my 15 years of working with the Congressional Management Foundation, it is without a doubt the highlight of my professional career, and working with these wonderful, dedicated public servants, just trying to make the institution of Congress work better.
Thanks a lot. That was what I was hoping to hear from you. That was a great recap of what's going on with the modernization of Congress, and what you had talked about was on point there. I'd like to know right now that we did have some Zoom issues. People can the people listening in can no longer see the slides we're putting up, but they can see you guys as the panelists. So it's changed up a little bit, but that was a Zoom issue. You guys probably didn't notice it too much, either Brad or Doug, but just want to give, also the people participating understand what went on and why maybe they're not seeing the slides anymore. But do you have, Professor, do you have anything to add to that one as far as modernization of Congress?
Yeah, there are, I do just a little bit. There are sort of public relations problems. There are these externality issues that people don't trust government much, don't trust the government in Washington very much. And to try to sell the notion of raising the salary of members, or I think really what needs to happen is you need to raise the salary of staff people so that it's a viable career for 15 years for a person, a bunch of staff people in committees and other places, so that they learn, after they learn enough to do their job well, they stay around for a while to do that job well. The advisor to the speaker, the advisor to the committee chair, the subcommittee staff director. But it's externally, it's a very hard sell when people do not trust Washington, or do not trust government, do not trust what's happening in their political institutions that seem so far away in Washington. But to me, it's an absolute practical reality that you get what you pay for. And to some extent, you really, if you want well-qualified people who could go across the street and make $500,000 a year as a lobbyist, if you want them to stay on the Hill, there are other benefits than money to be within the political system in the House and the Senate. But to cap a staff salary, make $150,000 when you're looking at someone across the street who isn't as qualified as you, making 3 times that. That's just a reality of the marketplace for wages and salaries and the cost of living in Washington. that you're going to lose the institutional memory, the substantive memory, the procedural knowledge, and then the human network. To get things done in the House and Senate, it's a human network. It's friends and relationships, and that's really important as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then one of the things too that in having my conversations with individuals on Congress is that they talk about how much each congressional member makes, but the thing is that they fail to understand, and I have to bring up is that, well, can you imagine living in two cities and one of them being very, very expensive and having two places to house yourself and pay for housing and other expenses that go with it. And once you put into that perspective, it's like, yeah, wow, they're not getting paid all that much compared, especially for the ones that live both in expensive places, both in their home district as well as in DC. And the other thing is too, Brad, you can probably let us know this, but what's the starting salary for a legislative assistant starting in? I think when I was there in DC, when I was interning at CMF, it wasn't very much. So what is it right now?
It's about $48,000 a year, and most congressional staffers at that level, which legislative assistant level, usually have roommates and have group houses, because it costs, you get a 1-bedroom in Washington these days, just the rent alone is about $3,500 a month in a good neighborhood. So it's really not practical. You have to have roommates. It just one of the impact of the coronavirus and working remotely for congressional staff is that they're doing a lot of Zoom calls, they're doing a lot of phone calls, but they're doing more phone calls than Zoom calls. And when we explored with staff why that is, there were basically two reasons. One, they couldn't have a private room because they have roommates and they just didn't want to do it from their bedroom. And two, they didn't want to change out of their pajamas because they're pretty lazy dressers. So if you are doing any interviews or conversations with congressional staff, it's okay to do it by phone because that's usually going to make them a little more comfortable. So it has been an unusual, unexpected impact. But as you both have referenced, the pay issue is really tough. It's like, do you want the best tax attorney in America working for the largest corporation against you, or do you want them serving on the House Ways and Means Committee as a chief counsel working for you? And that's a question that the Congress has faced. And you think about things like cybersecurity. Zoe Lofgren, who's a congresswoman who represents part of Silicon Valley from California and who's on the Modernization Committee, staff salaries are capped at the same level as members of Congress. So you can't pay anybody more than $173,000 a year, which she pointed out is like a starting salary for an entry-level person at Google. You try to get a cybersecurity expert to come to Washington for $173,000 a year. It can't be done. And so we are dealing with, on some levels, not the top brass when you're dealing with cybersecurity issues in the United States Congress. They do a great job. Don't get me wrong. And I don't want to be going on the record dissing the chief administrative officer or the House Information Resources Officer or the Senate CIO. They do a really, really good job. My point is they could probably do a better job with a bigger budget, and they should have a bigger budget given the amount of threats that are being sent into the United States Congress on a daily basis.
And the other thing is too that's changed is the population has increased in America, but the staffing has either remained about the consistent same level. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, population since 1980 has risen by 31%. That means every member of Congress on average represents a third more people. Total staffing, as Doug referenced, in the House and Senate has gone down 15%, but total budget buying power since the 1990s has dropped about 20%. The total number of staff that a member of the House of Representatives can have as full-time staff is 18 full-time staff. That law that is set by law, that law was passed in 1974. That's the last time they got a staff increase. I don't know any industry that could see a type of explosion in interest that they're getting from constituents, whether it's good or bad, and have zero increase in capabilities and resources, how they're going to be able to deal with it. And that's one of the challenges we face.
Thanks. Yeah. And that's the reason why the modernization of Congress is so important moving forward. And obviously, when you hear the conversations in the districts and or congressional members do, and they start hearing, oh, more money for Congress, more additional salaries, they're like, oh, wow, they can't survive on their own. But you guys really do put in a good perspective on why that's important. And hopefully that the members of Congress will be able to make that sales pitch to the voters at some point on why they're making, now, not that the voters have to approve that, but it is one that will make it really difficult for them to get, for elected or reelected if that's one of their main pieces of legislation they're pushing. So appreciate you guys going over that, why that's important. You had also, Brad, just talked about how some of the legislative staff members, they're 4 people to a house and they can't do the Zoom calls because of just the setup there. Can you talk about the COVID and how that's had an impact in Congress since last year, and some of the lasting impacts on that will be a benefit Congress and constituents moving forward as well?
Sure. I'm just pulling up a little research I have from our website. And if you're interested in more information on this, you can go to our website at congressfoundation.org, or just Google Congress Foundation and coronavirus, which regrettably that Google search works. I wish it didn't, but you'll find our report that we released in August of last year called Congress, Coronavirus, and Constituent Communications. It was based on a survey that we conducted of congressional staff in May and June of last year. So it was still, the remote working had happened, and they were just settling into a routine that ended up settling in. And one of the questions we asked congressional staff was looking towards the future and the impact that coronavirus and remote working would have on members of Congress. And the question we asked went like this: looking to the future and the long-term impact of COVID-19 crisis is likely to have on you and your office operations, please indicate whether you expect to increase, decrease, or keep the same amount of time and resources dedicated to the following. So this is congressional staff predicting what they think they're going to do. 77% said they're going to be increasing the amount of time that they're spending in video conferences and in remote engagement opportunities with their constituents, and 67% think they're going to decrease in-person meetings. Now, on some levels, what we're seeing here when it comes to the citizen advocate community is you're winning and losing, and you're giving up some stuff and you're getting other stuff. And let me just amplify that. Yes, you're giving up that one-on-one in-person connection that only human beings can have when they meet face to face. And that's true. But what you're gaining is the potential of having more people having a connection to it. I'll give you one example. We work with one group, as patient advocacy group, on their training programs. And normally they bring about 1,000 to 2,000 people to Washington each year to advocate for more federal funding into researching their disease, 1 to 2,000. This year, they're doing a virtual fly-in, and they're asking, how do they engage 20,000 people? So instead of a meeting with 5 people and the senator from Oregon, it'll be 25 people. Now, that extra 20 people have now been engaged. They've had a positive experience. They've had an interaction with an elected official. They'll stay engaged. They'll write letters to the editor. They'll meet their local officials. So there is definitely some lemonade to be made of these lemons for the creative organizations. And I encourage you too, as you get engaged with your state association and have the opportunity to, talk with somebody in Tallahassee, and you don't have to leave Miami to do it, or Key West, worse, I've been to Key West many times, you have the opportunity to just erase geography and geographic barriers. Now, what we're also finding is for those associations and nonprofits that set up these meetings, you've got to be a little bit more planful. This is like a television show. So who's going to do the technology? Who's going to operate the camera? What's the platform going to be? Who's going to be your actor and supporting actor? You don't have to have everybody talk. You just have to have somebody with the best story deliver it. So there's definitely ways that citizen advocates are figuring out how to use both online and offline interaction technology and capabilities to enhance their voice in Washington.
And Professor, do you have anything to add to that as far as what you saw when you were actually in DC with the students from Calvin University for the semester in DC, and how you pivoted during that?
So with the coronavirus thing, we faculty, we had about a week to figure out how to teach online. We were all doing in person, and I had dabbled a little bit with online and Teams meetings and Zoom calls and things like that. But in DC, we dismantled the residential program in DC last spring, and some students stayed in Washington, others went back to their homes, others went back to campus, and all of a sudden, rather than having class with 20 students in one place for 3 hours in person on a Monday night. I had students in 7 different locations in a Zoom call or a Teams call for the rest of the semester. Now, I'm incorporating that, and when things get back to normal, hopefully this coming fall, we'll do more and more in-person instruction without many restrictions. We're teaching in person now at Calvin, and I'll incorporate some of that, particularly recorded Zoom meetings and things like that in my pedagogy. So we'll keep some of that going, but it was just a crash course in learning how to meet virtually, and then take advantage of, over time, you learn how to take advantage of it, how to limit the liabilities, and how to maximize the opportunities of the new technology.
Thanks there. Is there anything that I didn't cover that you guys had wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I want to say how helpful lobbyists are to the legislative process, and how helpful they can be, and how you can be helpful, citizen lobbyists or professional lobbyists. I mean, the one thing is accurate information about the consequences of the policy you're advocating or being opposed to. But the other thing you can help a member of Congress do, it's a hard thing to get 217 other people in the House to agree with you if you're a member of Congress. And so really providing sort of member-to-member intelligence about where other members are, where other state delegations are, where other key actors are in a position on a particular issue, you can provide sort of this political terrain information to your member of Congress. Legislative staff are incredibly busy, and to some extent very short-term range. So help the member of Congress not only be substantively knowledgeable, but to be strategically thoughtful about how to achieve the objective in a system where you have to get 218 votes. So you can provide many services beyond information about the issue that you're concerned about. You can help share, if you trust the member and you have a good relationship with them, you can help them try to accomplish something through a complicated legislative process. It's a logical process. It has some steps, but it's actually fairly clear cut. And congressional staff are very busy and not always well experienced. And you can help them not only on the substance, but on the process and on the procedure, because I think every member of Congress wants to accomplish goals on behalf of their constituency. And knowing where the other 435 members are is as important as knowing the substance of the issue.
Is there anything that, Brad, that we didn't cover that you had wanted to at all?
No, just if someone could tell me how spring training's going, that would be great. I'm delighted that we're getting baseball back again. It was a real scary time when we didn't think we were going to have baseball. I don't have a lot to brag about. The Nationals did terrible last year, but at least we got to watch some baseball games. So if any of you guys are going to spring training, report on back. I want to hear anything and everything that's going on in baseball.
Yeah, they've already started reporting here and spring training in Florida. So that's and actually where I live, I'm only about 2 miles away, or a mile away from where the Phillies play. So it's great, but yeah, so the other thing is too, so Brad, thank you for everything you do with NAR. We appreciate it. It's been great having CMF partner with you and your organization for especially our FPCs, and then also with our government affairs directors and some of the training that you guys provide to us in DC. So you guys are very invaluable. And I think there's, I don't know if it was shown earlier, but Derek, if you could bring it up, the photo of Brad that I have from 18 years ago, I want to say, right there.
Oh my
when
God.
I had at CMF there. So that's when I was at Calvin.
Nice.
So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So, oh my God. I was skinny and had no beard. That's incredible.
That's the Travis I remember too. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is that, and also the other thing is too, I also have distinguished, I'm also distinguished to have a run against Professor Doug Koopman in a local election there, but I finished in second place. Luckily, it was pick 2, so and so the top 2 got in there, but I still went door to door, and he did not, and he still got more votes than me. And
name ID, gotta say, I had better.
It is so. But so I appreciate having both you guys here. Thank you for being generous with your time. Greatly appreciated. And also, For our Alliance members, I am working on the next one in May. That one will be with the Chief Advocacy Officer at NAR, Shannon McGann, and Florida Realtors VP of Public Policy, Daniel Scoggins. So we're looking to schedule that at the end of May. So that's the next one. So I appreciate everyone for joining today and the conversation we had today. If anyone has any follow-up questions for Brad or Professor Koopman, please let me know. You guys know my email at tnorton@tampabayrealtor.com. So thank you.
Right, yeah, thank you very much.